ruthlessly ridiculed for his financial ruin and legal failings. Dustin Diamond ended his days as a disgraced tabloid fixture and a public punchline. Yet, this same man was once universally adored as the ultimate symbol of childhood innocence. The answer to what happened to Screech, the dark reality behind Dustin Diamond, lies in a brutal paradox. Why did the very public that cherished the on-screen vulnerability of the character Screech so mercilessly punish the real-life frailties of the man who played him? Dustin Diamond was born in 1977 to an ordinary family. At age 11, he was cast as Screech Powers in the sitcom Good Morning, Miss Bliss, which later exploded into Saved by the Bell. He won the role because of his naturally nerdy look and easy humor. His family saw it as a massive opportunity. No one knew it was a life sentence. Saved by the Bell became a 90s television icon. But behind the scenes, the dynamic was fractured. On set, he worked alongside teen idols like Mark-Paul Gosselaar, Tiffany Thiessen, and Mario Lopez. Dustin was the outsider. The pressure to maintain his goofy persona, both on and off screen, was immense. The trap that closed around him was built from the very character he inhabited. He wore loud, mismatched shirts, spoke in a grating, high-pitched register, and moved with a chaotic physical comedy that made him the immediate target of every hallway bully. He was the kid who was shoved into lockers, rejected by girls, and constantly used by his cooler, more calculating peers. Yet, within the heavily controlled environment of a television script, this weakness was completely sanitized. Screech was never genuinely harmed. He absorbed the humiliation, shook it off with a goofy smile, and remained fiercely loyal to the very friends who often exploited him. He possessed a good heart, a naive optimism, and a bizarre genius that often saved the day. For the millions of children and teenagers watching throughout the early 90s, this was a profoundly comforting image. Screech became a safe vessel for their own private insecurities. He represented everyone who had ever felt uncoordinated, out of place, or left behind. He made being the odd one out seem not only survivable, but genuinely endearing. This curated vulnerability became his primary currency. While other teen idols sold conventional attractiveness or rebellious edge, Dustin was tasked with selling pure, unthreatening submission. He mastered the physical language of a punching bag so well that viewers fundamentally forgot a real spine had to bend to take those hits. Every awkward stumble was a carefully choreographed surrender of his own dignity for our amusement. The public formed a deep, uncompromising attachment to this specific brand of innocence. The character was designed from the ground up to be fragile and in constant need of protection. But the audience made a fatal error. They conflated the teenage actor with the fictional archetype. They fell in love with a highly edited version of youth, a world where mistakes are resolved in 22 minutes and character flaws serve only as the setup for a laugh track. The machinery of the Hollywood studio system operates on a strictly transactional basis. The fundamental agreement between the industry and the actor is temporary and absolute. A performer steps onto a soundstage, adopts a fabricated persona, delivers the required narrative arc, and then physically and psychologically vacates the premises. They return the wardrobe, remove the makeup, and walk out into the civilian world as a blank canvas, ready to be hired for the next project. For the vast majority of working actors, this mechanism functions seamlessly. However, for a very specific subset of child stars embedded in highly successful long-running sitcoms, this contract is frequently violated. For Dustin Diamond, the contract was completely obliterated. Saved by the Bell ended in 1993. When production concluded, Dustin did not walk off the lot as an independent professional. Producers only saw Screech. When a young actor is defined by a broad comedy role, casting directors refused to see them as adults. Dustin tried to change his image. He cut his hair. He changed his style. It failed completely. He walked out shackled to a cultural ghost. Much like Jaleel White as Steve Urkel, the industry locked him in a permanent cage. The scale of this professional suffocation became agonizingly clear during his career transition in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Dustin did not passively accept his fate. Historical industry accounts and retrospective analyses note that he aggressively attempted to pivot away from his sitcom origins. He recognized the necessity of proving his versatility. He actively pursued dramatic roles, sought out independent cinema, and auditioned for gritty television procedurals. He wanted to execute the standard, necessary evolution from an adolescent entertainer to a serious adult actor. He walked into audition rooms, carrying scripts that demanded emotional nuance, profound anger, and mature complexity. He arrived fully prepared to demonstrate the seasoned range of a veteran performer who had spent more than a decade mastering the intense pressure of multi-camera television production. The rejection he encountered was not based on a deficiency of technical skill or a lack of preparation. It was a systemic, impenetrable refusal by the industry to accept his physical and psychological reality. Casting directors and studio producers function primarily as risk managers. Their fundamental objective is to maintain the audience's suspension of disbelief. When these decision-makers looked at Dustin Diamond, they did not see a 20-something actor delivering lines for a homicide detective or a complex antagonist. They experienced immediate and insurmountable cognitive dissonance. They looked at his face and saw the brightly colored, mismatched shirts. They heard his natural speaking voice and mentally superimposed the manufactured, high-pitched vocal inflections of his youth. They saw a 14-year-old boy trapped inside the body of an adult man. The visual and cultural association was simply too dense to pierce. The feedback he received from these casting sessions was brutally consistent and uniformly devastating. He was told repeatedly by various networks and independent casting agencies that they saw too much Screech in his performance. This specific phrase requires careful analysis. Too much Screech was not a constructive critique regarding his method, his timing, or his emotional delivery. It was a terminal diagnosis of his very identity. It meant that his natural facial structure, his resting posture, and his mere physical existence had become toxic assets to any production attempting to tell a serious or grounded story. The character he had spent his formative years painstakingly building had mutated into a permanent professional prison. He was essentially being penalized for executing his previous job with flawless precision. It was a bizarre professional paradox where his undeniable competence became the exact instrument of his termination. He had not failed as an actor. Rather, he had succeeded so completely that he permanently broke the audience's ability to see reality. The industry essentially punished him for his own mastery, transforming his greatest professional achievement into an unscalable brick wall. The better he had played the fool, the tighter they locked the door. Typecasting is frequently dismissed by the general public as a minor career inconvenience, a manageable scenario where an actor is merely forced to play the same genre of roles repeatedly. However, many media historians and sociologists argue that for performers in Dustin's precise situation, typecasting functions as a form of aggressive psychological erasure. It was not merely the loss of future financial employment. It was the theft of his fundamental right to mature. On the television screen, the fictional entity of Screech was permitted a chronological trajectory. The writers allowed the character to graduate from high school, to navigate university environments, to secure employment, and to interact with the world, albeit always within the sanitized, heavily regulated safety of a sitcom format. The fictional boy was granted a future. The flesh and blood man was categorically denied one. Hollywood demanded that Dustin remain permanently frozen in a state of arrested adolescence. The industry only validated his existence when he provided the specific brand of harmless, clownish entertainment they instantly recognized. When he ceased to be that boy, when he naturally aged, when his hairline receded, when his voice deepened, and when the inevitable physical wear and tear of adult life altered his appearance, He was treated not as a human being, but as a defective commercial product that had outlived its utility. He was discarded because he could no longer seamlessly project the illusion of perpetual innocence. This psychological claustrophobia was massively compounded by the structural power dynamics of the television syndication market. The late 1990s and early 2000s marked a historic boom in global syndication rights. While Dustin was sitting in casting offices being told he was completely unemployable, his teenage face was broadcasting across the globe, 24 hours a day, generating massive, continuous revenue for corporate networks. He was forced into a daily, unwinnable competition against a flawless, immortal version of himself. In the television reruns, the character never aged. The digital clone never required a living wage, never experienced clinical depression, and never exhibited the ugly, complicated, and desperate realities of adulthood. The broadcasted ghost was perfect. The living, breathing man was viewed as a liability. The television screen acted as a cruel mirror, constantly reflecting a timeline where he was forever safe and employed. If he walked into a grocery store, the face on the monitors above the aisles mocked his current unemployment. This relentless digital haunting ensured he could never quietly slip away. He was forced to watch his own phantom thrive while his physical body starved. The sitcom syndication was a daily broadcast of his own irrelevance. Every time a network executive passed on casting him, they were actively choosing the ghost over the man. They were protecting the pristine, highly profitable memory of a television franchise from the messy, unpredictable reality of a human being. This dynamic creates a profound structural isolation that very few individuals on Earth can comprehend. Imagine dedicating the entirety of your childhood to mastering a highly specific trade, succeeding at the highest possible global level, and anchoring a franchise that defines an entire generation, only to be told in your early 20s that your exact level of success is the very reason you are permanently banned from the workforce. He was not blacklisted for incompetence, unprofessionalism, or a lack of talent. He was effectively blacklisted because he was too recognizable. To be a functioning adult in society is to possess the fundamental right to be deeply flawed. Adults make catastrophic errors in judgment. They harbor dark impulses, they suffer in silence, they fail publicly, and they attempt to rebuild. Dustin was systematically denied this basic human privilege by the public and the press. If he displayed genuine anger regarding his situation, the media framed it as a comedic breakdown. If he displayed genuine despair or frustration, it was viewed as pathetic rather than genuinely tragic. The entertainment ecosystem had placed him in a cultural straitjacket. He was only permitted to be innocent, weak, and funny. But the reality of chronic unemployment, dwindling finances, and constant daily rejection is completely devoid of innocence, and it is entirely devoid of humor. Many ask why he did not simply abandon the entertainment industry altogether and transition into a standard civilian career. This question ignores the physical reality of global fame. He found himself entirely trapped in a void between two incompatible worlds. He could not move forward into dramatic, adult acting because the industry categorically refused to suspend its disbelief. He could not move backward to reclaim his youth because time and biology made it impossible. Furthermore, he could not simply disappear into an office job or manual labor. His face was one of the most recognizable on the planet. Attempting to work a normal, public-facing job guaranteed he would be stared at, approached, secretly filmed, and endlessly mocked by a public that felt a false, deeply ingrained sense of ownership over his identity. The walls of his reality closed in with terrifying speed, leaving him with an agonizing, inescapable realization. The only thing society valued about him was a fictional child he could no longer play, and the primary obstacle destroying his future was his own face. When the protective walls of the television studio finally collapsed, Dustin Diamond was thrust into a financial and social reality that his on-screen alter ego would never have to face. The brutality of his descent dismantles the prevailing myth of child stardom and infinite wealth. The public operates under the persistent assumption that visibility equals infinite financial security. Viewers assume that because they see an actor's face on their television screen every single day, that actor must be shielded by an impenetrable fortress of wealth. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, this was a catastrophic illusion. The contracts drafted for young actors during the initial run of his hit series were fundamentally exploitative by modern standards. While the network and executive producers generated hundreds of millions of dollars in global syndication revenue, the actors themselves were often cut out of long-term residual profits. When the show ended, the primary income stream simply evaporated. Dustin Diamond was a man in his 20s possessing a globally recognized face, an unemployable acting resume, and a bank account that was rapidly hemorrhaging funds. This is the exact intersection where the tragedy of his specific typecasting metastasized into a public spectacle. He was not merely a struggling actor looking for rent money. He was a cultural icon tumbling into poverty in real time. By 2001, the financial strain had become untenable, forcing him to file for bankruptcy. This was not a quiet, dignified restructuring of assets. It was a loud, publicly documented collapse. Poverty is an isolating experience for anyone, but for a globally recognized face, it becomes a spectator sport. He could not downsize his life in private. His eviction notices were printed in tabloid ink. The financial ruin stripped away the final protective layer of his celebrity status, leaving him entirely exposed to a society that equates wealth with moral value. He was broke, he was famous, and therefore he was entirely defenseless. On television, the character of Screech was perpetually insulated from genuine harm. If he made a mistake, broke a prop, or found himself in a convoluted predicament, the narrative structure of the sitcom guaranteed his rescue. His friends would devise a scheme. The authority figures would offer a stern but loving reprimand, and the crisis would be resolved before the final commercial break. Screech lived in a sterile universe where consequences were temporary and community support was absolute. Dustin Diamond lived in the American Midwest, where mortgage companies do not care about television ratings and utility companies do not accept nostalgia as payment. The starkest manifestation of this brutal reality occurred in 2006. Dustin found himself facing the imminent foreclosure of his home in Wisconsin. He was 30 days away from physical eviction. In a desperate maneuver to save his property, he launched a campaign that would permanently alter his relationship with the public. He created a website and publicly pleaded for his fans to help him raise $250,000. He sold t-shirts bearing the phrase, "I paid $15 to save Dustin's house." He offered personalized phone calls to anyone willing to donate a specific amount. From a purely human perspective, this was the act of a terrified man backed into a corner, utilizing the only leverage he had left to avoid homelessness. He was asking the millions of people who claimed to love his work for a minor fraction of financial support. The reaction he received, however, was a masterclass in societal cruelty. The public did not respond with empathy. They responded with aggressive, vitriolic mockery. The media immediately seized upon the foreclosure campaign, framing it not as a tragedy, but as a bizarre, pathetic comedy. Late-night television hosts used his impending homelessness as a punchline for their monologues. Gossip blogs and early internet forums dissected his financial ruin with a vicious sense of glee. The public openly laughed at him. The audience had spent a decade viewing this man as a harmless, goofy child who existed solely to provide them with light-hearted entertainment. Seeing that same figure standing on the digital street corner, impoverished, frightened, and begging for money, shattered their comfortable illusion. Instead of reconciling the fact that their childhood hero was a vulnerable human being in dire circumstances, the public chose to punish him for ruining the fantasy. His failures were violently magnified precisely because of the pristine, innocent image he had previously inhabited. If a gritty adult action star fell on hard times, the public might view it as a tragic consequence of a hard life. But when the beloved nerdy sidekick fell into poverty, the public viewed it as an absurd joke. The gap between the two images, the protected television child and the desperate, bankrupt adult, was simply too vast for the public to process with any degree of compassion. The traditional acting industry had locked him out. He desperately needed capital to survive. Dustin quickly fell into financial ruin. He took bizarre jobs just to pay the bills, from selling custom shirts online to transitioning into the unforgiving circuit of stand-up comedy and dive bar appearances. In 2009, out of sheer desperation, he published Behind the Bell. The book exposed toxic behind-the-scenes stories, alienating his former castmates forever. He lost his home. He lost his reputation. He was entirely bankrupt. He traveled across the country, performing in dimly lit clubs, sports bars, and regional entertainment venues. The audiences that paid to see him in these environments did not come for high-level theatrical performance. They came to gawk at a fallen idol. They arrived expecting to see Screech, hoping he would perform the old physical gags and recite his famous catchphrases. When Dustin stepped onto the stage, he actively fought against this expectation. He delivered abrasive, hostile, and often crude comedy routines. He was an angry man, exhausted by his circumstances, and deeply resentful of the audience that demanded he perform like a trained seal. He stood before a microphone, armed only with his genuine bitterness, facing crowds that had paid cover charges explicitly to see a cheerful cartoon character. The microphone became a weapon, a tool he used to violently shatter their expectations and punish them for their conditional love. Every crude joke was a desperate swing at the invisible bars of his cage. He was intentionally destroying the nostalgia they came to consume, trading their affection for their shock. The resulting clashes between Dustin and his live audiences were frequently disastrous. The crowds would heckle him, demanding the childhood character they remembered. When he refused, or when he insulted them in return, the crowds would turn entirely hostile. They booed him, threw objects at the stage, and documented his outbursts to sell to the tabloids. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. He needed their money to survive, but to get their money, he had to stand on a stage and allow them to hurl their disappointment at him. This era of his life fundamentally destroyed whatever remained of his professional dignity. He was taking jobs that were entirely unworthy of a performer who had anchored a global franchise. He appeared in low-budget, independent horror films, reality television weight loss competitions, and professional wrestling events. In every single appearance, he was hired strictly to be the punchline. The producers of these events did not respect him. They exploited his desperation. They knew that the public derived a sick thrill from watching the former television star demean himself for a paycheck. The cruelty of this period cannot be overstated. The public had created the image of Screech, consumed it, profited from it emotionally, and then completely abandoned the man who built it the moment he required genuine human grace. They watched him struggle to keep a roof over his head and decided that his suffering was prime entertainment. Every failed business venture, every hostile comedy set, and every desperate plea for financial assistance was weaponized against him. The audience demanded that he remain the innocent, lovable child of their youth, yet they actively participated in the destruction of his adulthood. He was learning, in the most painful manner possible, that the world does not forgive those who step out of the precise box society has constructed for them. The hero of the outcast children had become the ultimate outcast himself, and society was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of his ruin. There comes a definitive point in the trajectory of a blacklisted individual where the instinct for sheer survival completely overrides any remaining sense of public dignity. By the mid-2000s, Dustin Diamond had exhausted all conventional methods of sustaining his livelihood. The traditional acting industry had firmly locked its doors. The comedy club circuits were hostile, and his highly publicized attempts to crowdsource his mortgage had resulted in global humiliation. He was trapped in a financial and psychological corner. It was in this suffocating space that Dustin realized a grim economic truth. The industry did not want a mature Dustin Diamond, and they no longer wanted the innocent Screech. However, there was a highly lucrative market for the corruption and destruction of that innocence. If he could not secure employment by respecting his legacy, he would have to monetize its demolition. He was forced to weaponize the very cognitive dissonance that had ruined his career. This desperate calculus culminated in the 2006 release of a commercially distributed sex tape. To analyze this event purely as a moral failing or a lapse in personal judgment is to fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of celebrity exploitation. This was not a private indiscretion leaked against his will. It was a deliberate manufactured product engineered for maximum shock value. The entire financial viability of the tape relied explicitly on the audience's memory of the character he used to play. The tape did not sell because the public found Dustin Diamond physically desirable. It sold because the public harbored a morbid, cynical fascination with seeing the ultimate symbol of Saturday morning purity degraded on camera. He was selling the violent execution of his own wholesome image. By participating in the pornography industry, he deliberately aimed for the absolute antithesis of Bayside High. It was an act of profound self-sabotage designed to sever the psychological umbilical cord connecting him to the public. If they refused to let him grow up, he would force them to look away entirely. He dragged the pristine mascot through the mud, hoping the ensuing disgust would finally set him free. The most revealing aspect of this entire scandal emerged years later when Dustin admitted in interviews that he was not even the primary participant in the explicit scenes. He confessed to using a stunt double for the most graphic portions of the recording, splicing his own face into the footage only to establish continuity. This admission strips away the illusion of a man simply acting out his personal demons. It exposes the project for exactly what it was, a cold, calculated, and deeply cynical business transaction. He understood that the media ecosystem operated on controversy. He manufactured a scandal, grafted his famous face onto it, and collected the check. He had been denied the right to earn a living as a serious adult, so he chose to perform as a grotesque, hypersexualized parody of his childhood self. Society built a cage composed entirely of nostalgia, locked him inside it, and then enthusiastically paid him to set the cage on fire. Having crossed the threshold of public infamy, Dustin was immediately absorbed into the lower tiers of the reality television industry. Network executives understood that the fallen child star was now a reliable source of volatile entertainment. In 2007, he was cast in the reality weight loss competition program, Celebrity Fit Club. The producers of this show did not hire him to document a sincere journey of physical improvement. They hired him because a deeply frustrated, socially isolated man is guaranteed to generate conflict. When Dustin arrived on set, he did not attempt to present himself as a misunderstood victim. Instead, he leaned entirely into a newly crafted persona, the abrasive, antagonistic villain. Throughout the production, he was overtly hostile. He argued relentlessly with the host, antagonized his fellow cast members, and frequently refused to participate in the required physical challenges. The public watched in a state of captivated outrage. The contrast was incredibly jarring. The audience remembered a television character who was sweet, submissive, and infinitely eager to please. Now, they were watching a belligerent, aggressive man who seemed to actively despise everyone around him. But Dustin understood the brutal economics of reality television far better than the viewing public did. A polite, well-behaved Dustin Diamond receives zero screen time and is quickly eliminated. A volatile, combative Screech guarantees high ratings, prolonged contract weeks, and a larger payout. He was playing a role, one demanded by a market that thrives on human friction. He had effectively traded the prison of the lovable nerd for the prison of the unhinged antagonist, simply because the latter paid the bills. This strategy of systematic bridge burning reached its absolute peak with the publication of his 2009 memoir, Behind the Bell. If his own personal image was already entirely compromised, he decided to extract capital from the pristine reputation of the franchise itself. The book was a relentless, cynical takedown of his former castmates and the entire production environment of the sitcom that made him famous. It contained sensational claims of rampant drug use, rampant sexual escapades, and deeply unprofessional behavior occurring right behind the scenes of the wholesome children's program. The publication sent shockwaves through the entertainment press. It was viewed as the ultimate betrayal. He was attacking the very foundation of the nostalgia that millions of people held sacred years later when the financial returns of the book had dried up and the legal and social backlash had isolated him completely. Dustin attempted to distance himself from the manuscript. He claimed that a ghostwriter had heavily fabricated the most scandalous stories, exaggerating minor incidents into massive controversies to ensure higher book sales. Whether this defense was absolute truth or a belated attempt at damage control is ultimately secondary to the broader reality of the situation. He signed his name to the project. He participated in the press tour. He authorized the detonation. He did this because, at that precise moment in his life, controversy was the only currency he had left to spend. The darkest chapters of his life, the sex tape, the reality television brawls, the defamatory book, were not the actions of a man operating in a vacuum of healthy choices. These were the frantic, destructive survival tactics of a man who had been buried alive by his own legacy. If the Hollywood machine had allowed him to transition into a standard adult actor, if the public had permitted him to shed the brightly colored shirts and exist as a normal, complex human being, he would never have been forced into these degrading arenas. He did not choose to destroy his image out of malice. He destroyed it because the industry left him with absolutely nothing else to sell. The absolute nadir of Dustin Diamond's public existence did not occur on a Hollywood soundstage or within the offices of a high-powered casting agency. It occurred in the bleak, freezing depths of a Wisconsin winter. On the evening of December 25, 2014, inside a dimly lit local establishment called the Grand Avenue Saloon in Port Washington, the simmering desperation of his adult life violently boiled over into a physical reality. He was involved in a chaotic altercation that began over a dispute involving his then-fiancée and other patrons. The argument escalated rapidly from verbal insults to physical shoving. In the ensuing scramble, Dustin drew a switchblade pocket knife. A man was stabbed, sustaining a non-life-threatening wound to his arm. The police were called. The vehicle Dustin and his partner used to flee the scene was quickly intercepted, and the former television star was placed in handcuffs. This was the absolute rock bottom. It was an ugly, desperate, and entirely mundane tragedy, the kind of low-level barroom violence that occurs in regional towns every weekend and is usually relegated to the back pages of the local police blotter. But the man in the handcuffs was not a nameless local resident. He was the owner of one of the most recognized faces of the 1990s. When the police released his mugshot, it triggered a massive global media explosion. The true cruelty of his situation was laid bare in the exact language the press used to report the incident. The headlines splashed across international tabloids, entertainment news programs, and digital media platforms did not read, "Actor Dustin Diamond arrested for assault." Almost uniformly, the headlines screamed, "Screech stabs man in bar fight." This linguistic choice by the global media was not an accident. It was a calculated, highly profitable editorial decision that highlights the exact psychological trap in which Dustin was imprisoned. The media deliberately weaponized his fictional identity to maximize the shock value of the crime. Stabbing a man in a bar is a serious offense, but an unemployed, 37-year-old actor committing an assault is merely a depressing news brief. However, the mental image of Screech, the ultimate symbol of harmless, bumbling, Saturday morning innocence, wielding a switchblade in a bloody brawl, is a grotesque, irresistible spectacle. The press effectively resurrected the 14-year-old television character just to place the murder weapon in his hand. They did not report on a troubled adult man struggling with his environment. They reported on the violent corruption of a cherished childhood icon. The switchblade became a physical symbol of the severed contract between actor and audience. A plastic prop robot had been replaced by cold steel, obliterating the sitcom fantasy in a single bloody instant. The media did not see a frightened individual defending his partner. They saw a rogue, fictional character violating the terms of service. The narrative was instantly hijacked, turning a local crime into a national betrayal of trust. When the case went to trial in May 2015, the courtroom transformed into a theater of the absurd. The legal proceedings were heavily televised, turning a serious criminal trial into a grim extension of reality television. Dustin took the stand in his own defense. He testified that he did not intentionally stab the victim, claiming that the chaotic nature of the brawl caused the man to accidentally impale his arm on the blade, while Dustin was attempting to defend his fiancée from an unprovoked attack. He presented himself as a frightened man who panicked in a volatile situation, but the jury, the judge, and the millions of people watching the broadcast at home were fundamentally incapable of viewing him objectively. They were looking at a balding, overweight, exhausted man fighting for his freedom, but their brains were rigidly superimposed with the image of the quirky high school student in a Hawaiian shirt. During the cross-examination, the prosecution aggressively dismantled his narrative, painting him as a habitual liar who was manipulating the truth to save himself. But the public judgment had already been finalized long before the jury returned a verdict. The trial exposed the ultimate, devastating paradox of his legacy. The character of Screech was beloved precisely because he was weak, vulnerable, and always in need of rescuing. But when the real Dustin Diamond displayed actual, terrifying vulnerability, panicking in a dark bar, fearing for his physical safety, and making a catastrophic, violent mistake, society offered him absolutely zero empathy. The weakness that was endearing in a sitcom was deemed repulsive in the real world. He was not afforded the grace of being a complex, flawed human being who had snapped under pressure. He was judged strictly as a defective product. The public felt a profound sense of moral betrayal. Not because a man had been injured, but because Screech had broken the unspoken rules of their nostalgia. He was ultimately cleared of the most severe felony charge of reckless endangerment, but he was convicted of carrying a concealed weapon and disorderly conduct. The judge sentenced him to serve 120 days in the Ozaki County Jail. The transition from a globally protected child star to an inmate in a county correctional facility is a psychological collapse that very few human beings could ever comprehend, let alone survive intact. He was stripped of his civilian clothes, issued a standard inmate uniform, and assigned to clean floors and do laundry. He was entirely stripped of agency, reduced to an inmate number in a cold, concrete facility far removed from the glittering promises of his youth. Yet, even in a jail cell, the ghost of the character refused to leave him alone. The public reaction to his incarceration was devoid of any genuine sociological reflection on the perils of child stardom or the brutal machinery of the entertainment industry. Instead, society treated his prison sentence as a punchline. Comedians joked about how the nerdiest kid at Bayside High was now doing hard time. Internet forums were flooded with memes superimposing the character's face onto prison bars. The public consumed his incarceration with a cruel, vindictive glee. They relished the destruction of the innocent archetype. This is the most agonizing truth of his time at rock bottom. The character of Screech did not merely fail to protect Dustin Diamond. It actively condemned him. The overwhelming power of that fictional image acted as a magnifying glass that amplified every single flaw, mistake, and legal infraction he committed. If he had been a moderately successful dramatic actor, his bar fight and subsequent jail time would have been viewed as a sad but routine Hollywood downfall. But because he was Screech, his crimes were framed as a desecration of purity. He was never allowed to face justice as Dustin Diamond, a troubled, desperate man who had run out of options. He was prosecuted, convicted, and mocked by the world as a corrupted toy that the public was finally throwing away. The end of Dustin Diamond's life did not arrive with a gradual, dignified fade into obscurity. It arrived with the violent, terrifying speed of a terminal illness, and it was entirely shadowed by the very public that had mocked him for decades. The final chapter of his physical existence exposes the most condemning reality of all. The relentless public scrutiny he endured did not just ruin his career and his mental health. It ultimately played a role in the delay of his own medical care. In late 2020, Dustin began experiencing severe physical pain and noticed a massive, visible lump growing on his neck. A standard civilian, faced with such an alarming physical abnormality, would immediately seek emergency medical attention. Dustin Diamond did not. According to statements released by his close friends and representatives after his passing, he actively avoided going to the hospital for weeks. His reasoning was a devastating indictment of the culture that had surrounded him. He was paralyzed by the fear that someone in the hospital waiting room or a medical staff member would covertly photograph his physical deterioration and sell the images to the tabloids. He was terrified that his failing body would become the next viral punchline on the internet. The man was quite literally dying, but his primary concern was hiding from the vicious, mocking gaze of the public that had tormented him for 20 years. The ghost of his fame had made him too afraid to save his own life. He chose the silent agony of a growing tumor over the deafening roar of public mockery. This deeply ingrained trauma response proved that the psychological damage inflicted by the media had manifested into a physical death sentence. His fear of the camera lens was ultimately stronger than his fear of the cancer. The culture that had laughed at his pain for decades directly ensured he would suffer his final agony in total isolation. When the pain finally became so unbearable that he was forced to seek medical intervention in January 2021, the delay had proven catastrophic. The diagnosis was absolute and terminal: stage IV small cell carcinoma. It is an aggressive, rapidly spreading cancer that had already metastasized throughout his lungs and other parts of his body by the time the doctors discovered it. The medical professionals in Florida offered treatments to manage the pain, but the reality was unchangeable. There would be no comeback. There would be no final act of redemption, no gritty, independent film role to change the public narrative, and no opportunity to age into a respected veteran actor. The juxtaposition occurring during those final 3 weeks in January is deeply haunting. In a sterile hospital room, a 44-year-old man was undergoing aggressive chemotherapy, his body shutting down, his breathing labored, experiencing the terrifying, lonely reality of a terminal diagnosis. Simultaneously, on television screens and streaming platforms across the globe, the character of Screech was still running through the brightly lit hallways of Bayside High School. The fictional teenager was vibrant, loud, and bursting with immortal energy. The broadcasted ghost was in peak physical condition, generating laughter and advertising revenue, completely detached from the dying man who had given him life. Dustin Diamond passed away on February 1, 2021, merely 3 weeks after his diagnosis. He was 44 years old. The physical suffering of the man was finally over. But what happened in the immediate hours and days following his death is perhaps the most chilling aspect of his entire story. When a public figure dies, the media instantly builds a digital monument to their life. The news networks, the entertainment blogs, and the social media platforms flooded the internet with obituaries and tributes. But look closely at those memorials. Look at the photographs chosen by the editors of the world's largest media conglomerates. They did not show the 44-year-old man who had just lost his life to cancer. They did not show the adult who had navigated bankruptcy, public humiliation, and the brutal reality of the American legal system. Time and time again, the global press used promotional photographs from 1992. They published images of a curly-haired 14-year-old boy in a Hawaiian shirt, holding a prop robot or grinning harmlessly into the camera. This editorial decision was not a gesture of respect. It was an act of complete erasure. The media stripped away 30 years of his actual lived human experience because society was entirely uncomfortable with the adult Dustin Diamond. The public did not want to mourn a complicated, troubled, and flawed middle-aged man who died a painful death. They wanted to mourn the innocent mascot of their childhoods. By exclusively using images of Screech to announce the death of Dustin, society essentially confirmed that the man himself had never truly mattered. Only the fictional property mattered. The tributes pouring in from his former castmates and industry executives followed a similar, heavily sanitized pattern. They spoke of his comedic genius as a child, his ability to execute physical comedy, and the joy he brought to the set in the early 1990s. They carefully navigated around the deeply fractured adult relationships, the decades of isolation, and the absolute refusal of the industry to employ him when he was alive. In death, Hollywood welcomed him back into the fold, but only on the strict condition that he was remembered exactly as they had designed him. As a child, they forgave him, but only because he was no longer around to complicate the narrative. This is the ultimate tragic victory of the character over the actor. Typecasting did not just steal his career, it completely consumed his posthumous identity. The man who had fought so desperately for decades to be seen, recognized, and respected as an adult was denied that right even in the grave. The real human being, the man who felt pain, who made terrible, desperate choices, who fought in courtrooms and dive bars just to survive, was quietly swept away into the dark. Dustin Diamond died on a Monday morning in a Florida hospital bed. But Screech did not die. Screech remains perfectly preserved in digital amber, endlessly repeating the same punchlines on syndication networks, forever young, forever harmless, and forever loved. The horrifying question that remains is not why the public turned their backs on Dustin Diamond. The question is whether Dustin Diamond was ever truly allowed to exist at all, or if the character of Screech had simply swallowed him whole before his life had even begun. Dustin Diamond's death was not an isolated incident or a singular tragedy of a mismanaged career. It was the American entertainment industry functioning exactly as designed. His destruction was not a glitch in the system. It was the system operating exactly as it was designed. When a manufacturing plant produces a highly profitable commodity, it strips the raw material of its original form, processes it for mass consumption, and discards the toxic byproduct. Hollywood operates on the exact same industrial principles, but its raw material is human youth, and its byproduct is the broken adult left behind when the public stops buying the product. The story of Screech is the story of a corporate mechanism that industrialized innocence, monetized it on a global scale, and then aggressively punished the human being who dared to outgrow the packaging. Dustin's fate was mapped out long before he ever walked onto a soundstage. He was part of a predatory blueprint that claimed countless others. We saw this exact trajectory with Dana Plato and Gary Coleman from the sitcom Different Strokes. Like Dustin, they were cast as the ultimate symbols of wholesome suburban safety. And exactly like Dustin, the moment their physical reality deviated from the sanitized fictional character, the industry abruptly terminated them. She represented a pristine, unblemished version of American adolescence. And exactly like Dustin, the moment her physical reality deviated from the sanitized fictional character, when she became pregnant, when she aged out of the demographic, when she struggled with substance abuse, the industry abruptly terminated her. The public did not offer grace to a young woman in crisis. They offered scorn. They consumed her subsequent arrests and tragic early death with the same voyeuristic cruelty they applied to Dustin. The mechanism is identical. Hollywood creates the beloved child, the audience claims ownership of that child, and together they completely reject the flawed adult that child inevitably becomes. Even those who manage to survive the machinery bear the permanent psychological scars of the extraction process. Look at J.L. White, who played Steve Urkel on Family Matters. He was another highly intelligent, physically expressive young actor who was entirely buried under the weight of a monumental caricature. White survived, but he spent decades aggressively fighting to prove his basic humanity to an industry that only wanted to hear him deliver a catchphrase. He had to navigate the exact same cognitive dissonance from casting directors who refused to see the man behind the suspenders. These are not isolated casting difficulties. This is a systemic psychological violence inflicted upon young performers. They are taught during their most formative developmental years that their authentic selves hold absolutely zero market value, while a two-dimensional, fabricated version of themselves is worth billions. This brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of this entire narrative: the complicity of the audience. The entertainment industry only supplies what the public demands. We are not passive observers in the destruction of these individuals. We are the wardens of their prison. We demand nostalgia. We utilize television as a time machine, seeking the comfort of a fictional world where problems are solved in 20 minutes, and our favorite characters never age, never fail, and never die. But nostalgia is an inherently selfish emotion. It requires us to freeze human beings in time for our own emotional convenience. When Dustin Diamond stood in a courtroom or pleaded for financial salvation, he was disrupting our time machine. He was forcing us to acknowledge the ugly, deteriorating reality of time passing, and we hated him for it. We weaponized our memories of Screech against the reality of Dustin, punishing him for reminding us that childhood is temporary and adulthood is ruthless. The tragedy of the child star is rooted in the concept of identity theft, perpetrated not by a criminal, but by a corporation. When a network purchases a child's developmental years, they are effectively purchasing their identity. Dustin Diamond did not just play Screech, he was absorbed by him. The character was a parasite that fed on his physical youth, grew to monumental proportions, and eventually consumed the host. The public demands that actors maintain a strict separation between reality and fiction, yet we refuse to grant them that separation when the fiction is too comforting to let go. We trapped a human being inside a television set in 1989, and we spent the next 3 decades making absolutely sure he could never break out. The wreckage of this life reveals the true cost of our entertainment. Hollywood constructs magnificent, glittering facades of friendship, innocence, and moral clarity, but the foundation is built on the disposable lives of the young people hired to maintain the illusion. The gap between the pristine image of the child and the agonizing reality of the adult is a void that has swallowed generations of talent. It is a void created by a culture that prioritizes the preservation of a character over the preservation of a life. Dustin Diamond is gone, but the system that destroyed him remains fully operational, currently processing the next generation of disposable youth. Screech remains immortal, broadcast continuously into living rooms across the world, generating revenue for executives who never attended Dustin's funeral. The character achieved eternal life, but the man paid the ultimate price for that immortality. He was a brilliant, flawed, desperate, and deeply misunderstood human being who was completely erased by his own shadow. We loved the fiction, we despised the reality, and in the end, we left the man to die in the dark while we kept the television on.